Welcome back to Mental Health Matters. I'm Dr. Audrey Tang, and this is the show where we address all things mental health and well-being. My co-host today is Judith Crosier, and we are tackling the subject of domestic violence with this episode. So, Judith, well, first of all, great to have you on set.
Thanks for having me.
This topic is something I wanted to look at because I don't think we get it if it hasn't happened to us.
I think you're absolutely right. I think it is one of those things that unless you've experienced it, it's very, very difficult to absorb the impact it has on people, and also because people don't want to talk about it.
Yes, and that's understandable because in some ways it can feel embarrassing. It can feel, well, how did I get into this situation? But also, I don't think we realise that domestic abuse, domestic violence, it covers many different things. We know about physical violence, we know about physical abuse, but there's also financial abuse, there's also emotional abuse. There can even be pregnancy as a form of abuse, which our guest expert is going to be talking about as well. And all of these things can happen so insidiously. We don't realise it's going on.
No, well, I guess if whoever's carrying out the abuse starts in an opposite way, so they present as kind and generous and loving, and it's introduced very, very slowly, then I suppose the person who is at the other end of the abuse doesn't really realise it's going on because things change so slowly, and they might be realising much too late, and then they don't know what to do about it.
And actually, well, with that, there's two things, isn't there? This one is you may not be in a position to do anything about it because by that point you've committed, you've got children, or you've got other investments in that situation. But then the other thing related to it is that we don't always realise, and if we are with friends and family and have been isolated, they may not realise either because they only see you at every Christmas or birthday or sporadically through the year, and so they don't see those changes happening.
No, exactly. And if the person being abused does realise or comes to realise and are too deeply into their situation, they're financially bound to them or whatever it might be, then they then might start hiding it themselves. Yes,
that's true, because they don't maybe want to ask for help or think it's their issue to solve. And another issue that has come out in narcissistic abuse research is the concept of something called flying monkeys. Now, the word is taken from the Wizard of Oz. Right. It is the idea that the narcissist creates all of these people around them to do their bidding. And this can be friends and family of the person they're abusing, but because the narcissist does work for charity, or they seem so nice on the surface, you then even get friends and family saying, oh, but he's so lovely, or she's so good, I can't believe they would do that. And that's where you, as the person going through it, get even more isolated. Yeah. It's really, really frightening. And the problem is we can even become unwitting flying monkeys. So the thing about these flying monkeys is they can be malicious flying monkeys. So the narcissist is really bringing people together to kind of almost bully that person and get people on the narcissist side. But also there can be completely unwitting flying monkeys who just simply think, oh, but they did some work for charity. Oh, but, and then telling the person who may be trying to speak out, oh, you must be misunderstanding it. And
okay, I see. I've not heard that expression before. Yeah. And I don't really know the Wizard of Oz, but I get what that means now. And yeah, I can think of examples when that's absolutely happened to people I know. And it's not a very nice situation, because especially if there's a group of friends and one of them can see what's going on, and the other group of friends is so happy that their friend is happy with this person, but actually you as a friend know that that's not a healthy relationship and there's abuse going on, then that group of friends can then isolate the person that can see what's going on. So it becomes a big issue.
And you look like the bad guy then as well.
Exactly, yes.
And I think this is part of the problem. The reason why we really need to talk about this and want to take a deep dive into this is because if it's not in our landscape, if we don't see it, and thankfully if it hasn't happened to you, I'm really pleased.
Yeah.
But it's so hard to recognise if that's the case.
Yes.
And I think, and it is difficult, but having people share their experiences, and it takes such bravery to be able to do that, is one of the most important things. Now, I know you've mentioned that you know some people who have been through that.
Yes.
I mean, in your experience with them, would they even be willing to talk about it? Because that's why it's quite difficult, isn't it?
It's difficult. With a particular friend that I have in mind, she didn't want to talk about it, and as a group of friends, luckily in this case we could all see what was going on, and as the years went by, she came out less, she corresponded less, she suddenly, you know, had a lot of things to do. She can come and see us, and I think it was 5 years down the line. The little things that she did say, and we thought, well, if she's telling us this, what is she not telling us? So, you know, a good idea or not, a few of us went down, put her in the car, put her things in the car, brought her home, because we knew that was a really bad situation, and now she's very grateful to us for doing that.
Oh gosh, and it can be so difficult, because it's a bit like nailing your colours to the mast, and then suddenly that you're no longer a safe person to talk to because you're going to intervene.
Yes.
Now, we do have a very brave audience member who has agreed to share her story. We re-recorded her transcript with her permission by an actor because we wanted to protect her identity. And it's worth recognising that there is a pattern. So if you listen to what the actor says, it's her words, her transcript, you might recognise things. And if you are affected by anything, the links for support are on our Facebook page. Let's go over to our actor who's reading the words of our live guest.
I met him on a dating website. I was separated from my husband at that time, because my husband at that time had been having affairs. So this was about just moving on with my life and hopefully meeting somebody new and having myself happy ever after. He was quite intense from the beginning, asked for my number and was I going to message him. Very intense. I suppose I felt very flattered. He was very charming, very attentive, good sense of humour. We chatted. And I don't think I ever really went into it. Look, I didn't have any expectations, I just wanted a happy ever after. And I'd met somebody who I thought was lovely in the early days. The intensity did worry me a little bit. And then I found out he didn't divulge it, but I found out through a third party that he was still living with his wife at that time. So obviously that was a concern, because he didn't say he'd lied. And he was right, he hadn't lied. He just failed to divulge that. And I was very unsure of the relationship. But his wife at the time confirmed that they weren't together. They were just living together for financial reasons, and I didn't see that as anything that wasn't plausible, like people do it when relationships break down. So over the course of that year, like I say, he was very intense. I did try to end it or back off a couple of times with the relationship, but he would turn up with flowers. He would just come to your house. I remember, one occasion I was going to pick my children up from school and he appeared from behind a tree when I was going to park my car, and he just jumped in my car and wouldn't really leave the car to let me go and get my children until I'd agreed to give the relationship another go. But he said I was the love of his life, he would die for me, and in some ways you feel very flattered after you've been with somebody who's done nothing but had affairs, and you do feel quite flattered by it. And the relationship progressed very quickly to the point where I was agreeing to sell my house to purchase a bigger house so that he and his children at the time could move in, could stay with me and my children. Upon sort of moving in with him, it changed very quickly. We were engaged before moving into the house together, but upon moving into the house, there was an intensity to get married. His behaviour changed. It was very coercive, the manipulation of truth, the manipulation of context on his side. gathering support from other people because he failed to give context to things and so on. It was a very, very difficult, traumatising marriage. Very, very difficult, traumatising. So when I was selling my house, I was very unsure. I felt very nervous. I didn't feel something was right. But I think both things were going at quite a quick pace, very intense. I felt very overwhelmed. And he would say that he would get quite angry. "You don't love me. You don't love me." He said, "You know, you're not capable of feeling love," and kind of put it back on me, to which I felt very guilty. I felt guilty because I felt that I hadn't fallen in love as quick as what he was saying he'd fallen in love, if that makes sense. And so I didn't want to end the relationship. I had hope that my happy ever after, that I kind of agreed and went along with it. And when there was worries about the money side of things, he put up some money to reassure me that he wasn't trying to scam me. And then further into the marriage, when I was pushing back, I remember we had a particular argument and he was screaming in my face, and I put my hands on his shoulders just to push him back from my face. And we weren't quite at the top of the stairs, but we weren't far from it. And the exaggeration as his arms flew back, I knew there and then he was dangerous and that he could accuse me of anything. And that would be very difficult to... It's a he says, she says scenario. There's no witnesses there, and obviously you would feel very humiliated if people think that you're the abuser when you know you're not. And then there was another occasion again, arguing, and he would say, go on then. If I'm such a bad person, get a knife. Come on, stab me. And I remember, this is following the incident at the stairs, and I remember thinking, if I get a knife, if I do that, he'll turn this back on me and he'll hurt me, or he'll use it to his advantage. I'm the abuser, or I could be the one dead at the end of this, as a self-defence claim. But I suppose I didn't really speak too much about it because it was embarrassing. It was embarrassing that I'd engaged into a relationship that was like this. So you've almost become hypervigilant. You're trying to preempt their behaviour. If I do this, he's going to do that. It made me ill. Very ill. Very, very ill. I tried to leave him many, many times, even very early on, not long after I'd met him. Like I said, the intensity was there, and he went to my sister's home and he said to her that if she didn't convince me to stay in the relationship, he was going to end his life. So obviously I didn't want that guilt. I didn't want that responsibility that I could have been the cause of somebody ending their life. So I ended up back in the relationship again. Quite often I would say, I just want space. That's what I would say. I didn't want to hurt anybody, but I needed space. And I would have family members contact me turning up to the house. How can you cause this pain on him? Suggesting that I could be a gold digger, that if I didn't have him back I could be a gold digger. There was another situation where one would say, blackmailed me, that he would release financial information to my children's husband if I didn't continue with the relationship. And then the final time was again a threat to his life, and he sent me a video when he'd come to the house unannounced. And I knew that if I'd opened that door and he'd been able to isolate me, I would have been back in that relationship. So I refused to open the door, and he sent me a message of him pouring petrol into his car in the hope that I would agree to the relationship back in, and ultimately then again he used that story against me that I was the abuser. I felt I was going crazy. I really did think I was going crazy. Lots of self-doubt. I did. I'd lost 4 stone in weight, and I think towards the end with the behaviour, I really did feel that I could have took my own life to escape it. And having children of my own, I knew that wasn't a place that I could risk going to. So that's why for the final time I asked him to leave, just so I could have some headspace. And at that point I decided I had to fight to get out of this relationship for the children my children that I had. I was very fortunate I didn't have children with him, but for my children I knew I had to leave. I was so unwell by that point, mentally, physically. I was very, very unwell.
I really want to thank our viewer for sharing her experience with us, because it goes some way to explaining some of the things that you might experience, which you may overlook or you may dismiss. And I know that's something we recognise when listening to her.
Yeah.
There's such a pattern, isn't there? It starts off feeling all lovely and wonderful, almost too wonderful, exactly that happily ever after. And then these little things start changing, and really you can predict the stages. So it's almost as if when you start feeling something's not right, or they start isolating you, or they start doing that little thing where you just think, hang on, was that me? We need to take note.
Yeah, and I have another friend who was in a similar situation where she started off in a relationship and it was all amazing. It was stuff made of fairy tales, and the guy was, you know, really loving, and it was amazing. But over time, it slowly descended into what would be domestic abuse. There were stages. His behaviour started becoming a bit weird. He would ask his girlfriend to not speak to that friend, maybe. Oh, you don't really want them in your lives anymore. So she obliged, and you know, she's an intelligent person, but for love, I guess you would do anything.
I'm really glad you mentioned that, because it's so easy for people to think, oh, well, there's a personality, isn't there? Abusers go up. No, in actual fact, the more intelligent you are and the more sure you are of knowing what you're looking for, the easier it is for someone who's abusive to go, oh, well, there's the pattern. Now I know who to be, and then I'm going to present myself in that particular way. It's like a con artist. It's it's a long con.
It is.
And I sometimes question whether domestic abuse is the symptom of a financial abuse scheme. So whether you go into that relationship, the narcissist goes into that relationship wanting to get the house or to get money or to get some kind of financial benefit, and then the abuse just comes as secondary because that's how to keep somebody under control. Or sometimes if it's just that person is nasty.
That's quite interesting actually, because with this particular friend, an example, I didn't even think about that. But the guy spent all of her money, wanted to get a mortgage with her. Luckily, she didn't.
Yes.
So as the abuse went on, and it was very strange things like going for a walk with the dog, using the dog lead to tie her hands behind her back and leaving her in the middle of a field. And then that progressed to actual abuse, fracturing a bone, etc.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
I mean, let's take the dog leash example.
Yes.
It's so easy for somebody to say, that was just a bit of fun, you know, you didn't get the joke. And you are there kind of thinking, well, that wasn't very funny. But then you think back to all the times that he's been so nice.
Yes, and I guess she thought, well, he probably finds it funny, you know, she didn't find it funny, but you kind of gloss over it. But then as these things kept on happening and then they got worse and worse, there came a point where she thought, no, this has to stop. But she was lucky she could leave. Yeah.
Now, we are very lucky to have guest expert Lucinda Jones, and she is a community domestic abuse ambassador. She was trained by Women's Aid, and she's here to help us unpack some of those examples that our guest gave, some examples that we've been talking about. But she's joining us now to tell us, first of all, a little bit about her role as the domestic abuse ambassador within the community. Welcome to the show, Lucinda, and please tell us more about your role.
The domestic abuse community ambassador role is a voluntary role. It means that I have gone through a training with my local charity, which is Rise, which is the local refuge. And they have told me all about it, why it happens, how I can be more helpful. And people in the community are often people to find out first about it. So if someone's experienced something, and it might take a while for them to realise perhaps what's happening, then they are more likely to speak to a friend or a neighbour or a hairdresser or a taxi driver or someone other than their closest, the people that are closest to them. Because, I mean, it's a sort of strange setup, but we do that. We go to hairdressers and things, and we tend to sort of share a lot more than we would do normally. So the idea of the community ambassador role is that we are trained so that we will respond in a correct way. So a lot of people, a lot of survivors, so we use the word survivor rather than victim because it's more empowering. A lot of survivors will speak to people, and it's a way of us. They often speak to lots of people that don't know how to react. And it's fair enough. It's a horrible subject. It's terrible. It's awful that this is happening all around us all the time. So what we need to do is we have to make sure that there are people around that. So if someone comes to you and says, this thing is happening to me, you don't dismiss it, because it is easier, and it's a human thing. It's no one's fault for doing it. It's just a human thing where you go, oh, are you sure? I know he's so nice, but look at the charity work that he does. Look at all these wonderful things he does as well. And just completely and utterly dismisses the person who has been incredibly brave to come to speak. And so we refer to them as gate closers. And so what we want to do is we want to ensure that the person that they first speak to gives them a positive and useful response to them speaking out. I would point people to Women's Aid first of all, just because they're specialists in this specific area. They understand the nuances and understand how it all works. But I mean, sort of cards on the table. Before I did this training, I think I've said, why doesn't she just leave? Why doesn't she just go to the police? Why is she not doing this? So what we're doing is we're victim blaming. That's what we're doing. We're victim blaming. So when we're saying that, you know, you should have done this, you should have done that, we're not thinking about why doesn't she leave? Instead, we're saying that instead of saying, what is he doing to stop her from leaving? And that's an entirely different way of thinking. Having had, like I said, I've had multiple disclosures, I've had hundreds of conversations about this, and so I realised that it's so common for people to sort of to not be able to leave, not to be able to talk about it, to not believe. And when they do speak to people, then it's stopping it entirely. And so when I was doing my domestic abuse community ambassador training, what they did that I thought was a really interesting way of doing it was like they're saying, right, okay, let's really go through this. You're a survivor. You're going through this right now. You want to leave. You don't feel safe. Right, you leave. What now? Like, where do you go? Where's your money? Who's looking after you? Who's your community? Right now, every one of us has a small community of some sort in some way, shape or form, be it a school thing, be it a work thing, be it a friendship thing, neighbours. You know, we're all part of different, multiple communities. And so to leave all of that, to go to a place, presumably to not be found again by the perpetrator. But perpetrators, they are sneaky, they are manipulative, they will do all sorts of things to still control that person. Physical abuse, obviously, and violence is what's kind of known. Sexual abuse is another way. Psychological and emotional abuse, playing on fears is very much as an aspect. Like I was saying about anyone in a queer community that doesn't want to be outed, then that's a common thing to sort of to control in that way. So financial and economic abuse is another. Even in banks, because the banks have realised that this is an issue. There are even signs, like little stickers out there in some places that say, do you think you might be someone that's experienced financial abuse, and if so, please speak to us, and that sort of thing. Stalking, harassment, digital online. Also something, another thing that I'd learned that I hadn't known before is that we would use the term image-based sexual abuse as opposed to revenge porn, because revenge porn is a term we've all heard of. We understand what it means. But it suggests that someone's done something wrong that they need to be punished for in that respect when you use the word revenge. So that's why you'd use the image-based sexual abuse. And reproductive coercion is something that's actually come up quite a few times, actually. So it can be forcing someone to have an abortion when they don't want to, or it can be forcing pregnancy as well. So pregnancy is another time when domestic abuse is likely to happen when it hasn't happened before. Like, you might have been in a relationship before. Again, another thing I've learned from doing this. And so when you actually, they have to ask you 3 separate times. So when you're pregnant and you are going to the doctors, or you go to a midwife, or whichever your setup, I know it's all a little bit different in different community and different setups. So what they have to ensure, they've asked you on 3 separate occasions without your partner being there, how things are and stuff, because it is the likelihood of it starting then, for whatever reason, increases. And I mean, it's quite nice that it's known for that. So therefore, there's the opportunity to speak to people. And again, it's a slightly other person, isn't it, without there being sort of committing for too long. And so yeah, and sex without condoms is another one as well. But the really big one, the one that happens almost 95% of the time, I think they said, is coercive control. It's a massive amount, because it's not always the violence, it's not always the sexual, it's not always this and this. But the one thing it tends to be is the coercive control. So coercive control is, the simplest way of saying it is that you being forced to adapt your behaviours to fit with him. And whenever I've spoken to anyone about this is always the thing that comes up, just the manipulation of things. And I mentioned to you before that I love, there's a really good quote on coercive control, which is, she said, "What I remember most about emotional abuse is like it's being put into a box. How you end up there is the biggest trick. I never managed to work that one out. Maybe you think it's a treasure box at first. You're in there because you're special. Soon the box starts to shrink. Every time you touch the edges, there is an argument. So you try to make yourself fit. You curl up, you become smaller, quieter, remove the excessive offensive parts of your personality. You begin to notice lots of these. You eliminate people and interests, change your behaviour. But this box gets smaller. You think it's your fault. The terrible, unforgivable too-muchness of you is to blame. You don't realise that the box is shrinking, or who is making it smaller. You don't understand that you will never, ever be tiny enough to fit, or silent enough to avoid a row." And I just think that's so powerful, because that's what it is. You haven't asked to be in the situation. You are reacting to what's happening around you and what's happening to you.
Welcome to Business Boost. Today I wanted to talk about gaslighting as it pertains to the workplace, because it does happen in relationships, and the workplace is an area where we have relationships. It's also an area where there is an imbalance of power. Now, the term gaslighting came from the 1938 play Gaslight, which also outlined some of the behaviours to look for. And whilst these behaviours relate to intimate relationships and gaslighting and abuse in intimate relationships, they can also be seen in the workplace. So these are the things I want you to think about. Gaslighting is the systematic, long-term manipulation of somebody's thought process and views about themselves. It is not the same as having a bit of a difference of opinion, having a little bit of an argument, having a disagreement. This is a long-term, insidious behaviour. So think about that in those terms. It does often start with a pattern. It does often start with that love bombing, gaining your trust, becoming someone that you might confide in, becoming someone that you might look up to and ask their opinion of. It will be things like, "Oh, you're doing so well, you're fabulous, I'm so glad we hired you, you're absolutely brilliant." Now, be aware though that of course some people just behave like that ordinarily. It doesn't mean they're setting you up to be gaslit. It just means that they are positive people. So just be aware of what the baseline behaviour is, and anything that goes against that baseline, that's when those red flags should just be waving a little bit. So watch out for love bombing to start with. It goes on though, and it can turn into that little bit of isolation. It can be things like, you and me, we're a team. We don't need anyone else. We'll just do this together. And then from there, it can lead to you being asked to do things which are a little bit covert and maybe questionably on the ethical scale. So it might be things like, oh, just change that number. It'll be okay. And it might even be that person will say, so I'll take responsibility for it. That's fine. You don't need to worry about it. So just watch out for getting you drawn away into that little group. And then if you start recognizing it, if you start, like our viewer said, asking for space, asking for that little time apart, it might be that little group that's been formed turns into, you're oversensitive. Why do you say that? You're always being like that, projecting bad behaviors onto you. And the difficulty here, especially if it's somebody who is in the hierarchical structure above you, you might just think, well, maybe it is me. And of course, we don't go to work wanting to do a bad job. We go to work wanting to improve ourselves. There are a few things that you can do if you think you are being gaslit at work. And the most important is to keep a diary. Keep a diary of times, dates, events, little occurrences, because if you do need to escalate it, then you have that information there. But the second thing is know the ways that you can escalate. If there is a whistleblowing policy, often that can mean you don't have to go through your direct manager because they may be the person who is causing you the problem in the first place. So be aware of your areas for escalation. But keeping that diary is really, really important. The third thing is, if you need to leave. Your mental health is more important, but I know not everybody wants to do that. So keep that diary and see where you can reach out for support. We are now going to return to our guest expert, who is going to talk about love bombing, because this is something that gains our trust, and we don't always realise that this is something that is going to be the start of somebody's way in to control us afterwards. So back to Lucinda.
This is the trick. This is what I've learned is the trick. So when you first meet someone, and love bombing is another term that we use quite a lot, and it's so common as well. So it was only 2 weeks ago that the third person that came forward to me, who was someone I knew, that I have to admit there was something I thought might be going on there, but I'm not allowed to go forward, because that's not going to make anyone feel safe. If I'm like, you, I think this is happening to you. It's just not. I'm there for when the person is ready to speak to me, and obviously there's other community ambassadors in the communities across the UK as well, and we all know that we are there for when that person is ready to speak to us. And one of the things that made me think is because she got married very, very quickly, like within a couple of months of meeting this person. And I know it's not always going to be the case, but it's just because of how I think now. There's always an alarm bell in my mind, like, oh, how come that happened so quickly? Oh, okay, right, okay. So yes, the love bombing thing it's an intense, initially appears to be romantic, but actually is just a bit too much constantly. But then when you sort of say, actually, this is too much, then there's the whole spin on it of going, well, it's your fault, you are broken, because your previous relationships, you are broken, and that's why you don't understand love, and then you feel bad, and then it's this whole sort of thing that continues on. So love bombing is like extreme romance. It appears to be a romance, but it isn't. It's just a way of bombarding someone, controlling them, and just making sure that they are, and also as a message to everyone else, like, she's mine. There's a control thing there as well. But the happy ever after thing is also part of the sort of why perpetrators can kind of get away with more, because people are going, well, why is she unhappy? She's in a relationship and he loves her so much. He sends her flowers at work and he does this, and he's outside waiting for her when she finishes work because he loves her so, so much. And there's not that point of going, hold on, that's not normal. Don't wait outside someone's work. That's controlling. That's stalking, that's harassing, that's tracking, that is following what someone's doing all the time. So they're never outside of their, so they're not outside of what they can see, and it's just very, very messed up. So yeah, so we're all kind of like sort of told that you must be with a man, and like that's how that will be your happiness. It should, I mean, things shouldn't feel scary. You shouldn't feel like you have to be quiet. You shouldn't need to feel like you're adjusting your behaviour. But so many people, until it got further on, have not realised that they were in a abusive relationship, because they're associating the violence, and if that's not happening, then they're just going. So something that really struck me so much in that first ever 1 hour webinar was that a lot of people don't realise they are survivors of domestic abuse. What they actually say is that he's just a bit controlling, and that really stuck in my head. He's just a bit controlling. So I'm part of RISE, which is a Brighton-based one, but it's Women's Aid. So you got the National Domestic Violence Helpline on 0808 2000 247. So there's that number. That is, I have to say, that's 24 hours a day. That never ever closes. That's always open. Because one of the disclosures I had happened over Christmas, and I realised that some services are not available over Christmas, but the National Domestic Violence Helpline is always open. And there's also the Women's Aid live chat service as well. And something else, so that's on, so it's chats.womensaid.org.uk. But if you just go onto the womensaid.org.uk, then I also need to point out there's a quick close thing. Because, of course, you might be looking at this in a scenario where you don't want someone to know that you're looking it up. And the quick close thing, you press on it and it goes to the Google screen. There's also advice on the Women's Aid website of how to clear your browser history as well. So make sure that you cover all steps whilst you're working out what you might want to do, who you want to reach out to, how it's going to work.
Thank you to our guest expert, Lucinda Jones, and links are on our Facebook page to get hold of Women's Aid should you need to. Now, I kind of wanted to go back to something that Lucinda said about the love bombing and that relationship when it starts. And I wanted to apply that to medical gaslighting, because we can get into a strange situation with our medical providers, because they are caring individuals, they're very nice to us, and so we think we can reach out for help, and then they tell us, oh no, just go away and take some paracetamol and it'll be fine, and come back if you've got a problem. And it's been shown in research that women experience this more than men. That's the first thing. And secondly, I know in my own experience, my dad, he will listen to any medical professional because that's what he's been brought up to do. He won't ask for a second opinion. He won't say, oh, hang on a minute, that medication was fine for me before. He will just take those changes, and it might be making him really ill, and then it becomes a problem. And medical gaslighting is not necessarily a deliberate behaviour, but it is about how we can respond when we've been dismissed. And so, have you ever had that sort of situation? Yes,
in two different forms, really. So personally, I've been to the GP with something that I know isn't right, and the particular GP I'm seeing might say, oh, well, you know, it could be nothing. I think you should just monitor it, see how it goes, go home and come back. And that might be fine, and that might be a genuine case for doing that, because sometimes, as you've said, wait and see, you know, is a treatment in itself. But when that happens more than once, and when you know that something isn't right, and you know your own body, and you're kind of being told that you might not know your own body, so I think that's a very minor form of gaslighting, if gaslighting can be minor. And especially if that carries on. If you go back a second time and you say, no, actually this is really serious, and then it's taken seriously, that's a completely different matter. That's all fine. But also I've experienced it with my dad, and that was a lot more serious. So he went into hospital, he had a couple of heart attacks, he'd never really been ill in his life, and it was horrible to see him like that, but we were told, oh, he'll be going home on Friday, so he'll have been in the hospital for about a week or so. And a couple of days before he was due to go home, he got worse and worse and was confused. And I was told that's entirely normal, and I said, and I knew it wasn't, and it wasn't normal. And I insisted on different tests, and they said, no, he's just in hospital, you know, it's normal. And it wasn't, and they did the test eventually because I kept asking, and it turns out that the medication he was on for his heart attack was affecting something else, and that was the beginning of the downfall, and he never came out of hospital. So there were two things about that. It was over the Christmas period, so there weren't enough staff to carry out the tests, but I was being told that I was making too much of a fuss. And he'll be fine, he just needs a rest. And it was evident that it wasn't, because I know my dad and they didn't. And yes, they're the medical people, but you know your family and you know yourself.
That's a big point that you're making there. It is, you know yourself best, you know your family best. And you raised the point about the watch and wait, and it is a medical way of dealing with things, because people don't want to do invasive surgery or something like that if actually it doesn't need to be done. But if it isn't feeling right to you, you can ask for a second opinion. You can keep asking. And then you make the other point, which is really important, about, is it a light form of gaslighting?
Yes.
And I would argue it's probably something more akin to something called moral distress. And moral distress or moral injury is when the professional, it's a medical situation where the professional is under so much pressure themselves that they end up causing injury or distress to somebody else without meaning to. It's just short-staffed, or maybe they are put in a situation where they don't have the full training, or they've been asked to cover and they haven't been briefed properly, but it does end up causing a lot of problems for other people. But it then comes back to your very key point about, you've got to keep asking, you've got to keep speaking, you've got to keep saying things.
Absolutely. You know when something's not right, really not right, and then that's the time not to let it go, I think.
It's really interesting. A good friend of mine, Pat Rollo, she runs a hospital radio called Speak Up and Talk Radio, and this started off as a means of her trying to get people to speak up rather than just taking it. We just need to say. And she shares her own experiences of her mum and how the very first time she was confronted with certain medical information, she just didn't say anything. She stayed quiet, and she understands, we all understand how easy it is to not say something because we think they're the professional.
Exactly. Why would you argue with a medical professional? Ultimately. And then that balance kind of shifts when you get more and more convinced in your mind that it's something definitely is wrong. And the doctors, for whatever reason, can't see it.
And the other point you make there about medication is that, yes, when a medication is changed, there may be other reasons for it, sometimes financial, sometimes and sometimes medications are pulled off the shelves for health reasons. But if a new medication isn't working for you, you are allowed to ask, is there another option? And it's only right. You know your body. I find it really sad when people don't.
I think you're right when you say it's a generational thing, but also the culture is that the medical professionals are the professionals and the experts. And that's the problem.
It's a very difficult thing. So again, as we say, if anything has resonated with you, we do have the links to Women's Aid, but be aware that you know your body the best. Coming up next, our resident nature expert, John Goldwyn, is going to be talking to us about how to rebuild our broken relationship with nature in Nature Watch. Following that, resident psychologist Dr Meg Arroll is going to be giving us her tips and tools for how to rebuild a relationship with ourselves, especially if we have been able to leave a relationship that's brought us down. And finally, resident coach Sharon Lawton is going to be giving us green flags for a healthy relationship.
Human beings have a biophilic relationship with nature. That means that somehow, through the fact that we've only industrialized relatively recently, really in the last few hundred years, we've always been close to nature, and as a result of that, even in these modern times when we live in cities and post-industrial age, we still relate well to natural things in our environment. Curvy design, curvilinear design, and softer, more organic forms seem to relate to our taste when we're choosing items. And also people feel a calmness and a stillness and a wellness when they're close to nature. So it's important to remember that there are opportunities for us to piece this biophilia into our life on a daily basis. It might be the house plant that you carefully choose. It might be the plant in your garden or your window box that you lovingly tend. Or it might be just the fact that you're able to go for a walk in your local park. These biophilic moments will make a difference to our life. The science proves it.
So, the first thing I want to say about developing a better relationship with yourself is that it is a complete and utter myth that you have to love yourself first. For many of us, we don't know how to do that because perhaps we haven't been loved unconditionally in the past. And so to say to someone, oh well, you've got to love yourself first, it's a huge mountain to climb. But we can start with self-compassion. And one technique I use with my clients is really about changing that inner critic. So the inner critic is that little niggling voice is right there on your shoulder that says, oh, you know what, Meg, you're not good enough. Oh God, you messed that up. Oh my God, what are people going to think? That really tinny little voice that berates you, criticizes you, and makes you feel just really bad about yourself. So to change that, what I like to do is to externalize the voice. So to start to think about, okay, so what does this voice look like? What shape is it? Is it round? Is it kind of spiky? What shape is it? And then think, okay, what's its color? What's its hue? Does it have a speed? Is it going fast or slow? Is it bouncing around perhaps? Does it have a temperature? Is it hot or cold? And it's really interesting when we start to really pull away the veil of this inner critic. And it's always fascinating to see what people come up with. I've had red socks, actually, lots of grey blobs, and sometimes it could be perhaps someone that we know, and that critic has been very externalized. So then, what I like to do is think, okay, so that's the inner critic. Now, who is your inner coach? And this is on the other shoulder. And again, think, what does this coach look like? What do they sound like? What's their voice like? And generally, it's encouraging, it's warm. And this could be someone that you know. It could be a fictional character. But the important thing is to really see in your mind's eye what both the inner critic and the inner coach look and sound like. Now, next time some of those really harsh thoughts are coming into your mind, allow them, because when we try to repress thoughts, they just pop back up. Because there's a little exercise we can do to show this. So don't think about a pink elephant. What comes to mind? Thoughts are exactly the same. So the inner critic could be there, say the grey blob, with those really critical notes and thoughts and voices. But then have your inner coach. So who is your cheerleader? And let them actually have a little bit of a conversation. Let them battle it out a little bit and see where you are. And in this way, over time, the inner critic will actually quieten. And then that will leave you with your inner coach who holds you accountable. It is a coach, but is encouraging and supportive. Give it a go.
Hello lovely viewers, my name is Sharon Lawton, a professionally accredited life coach and mentor. It's an absolute pleasure to be with you today while we dive into some more topics that have the potential to shape your life and your story. Today I'm shining a spotlight on green flags for a healthy relationship. So tip number 1, open communication. Now, communication is in the heart of all relationships, and it is so important that you're able to share your thoughts, your feelings, and your opinions without fear of judgment. We also need to listen actively, speak honestly, and create a space where we can feel truly valued and understood. So tip number 2 is that mutual respect for boundaries. Respect forms that solid foundation for healthy relationships. When both individuals value each other's need for boundaries and personal space, it creates a profound sense of trust and respect. In healthy relationships, partners become each other's greatest allies in personal and professional development. They encourage and support one another, recognizing that individual strengths support that need for growth. So until our paths cross again, make sure you take away one thing to reflect on and action. Because remember, if you want something to be different, you have to do something different.
Thank you so much for joining us today. And if you have been affected by anything on this show, the links are on our Facebook page. We wanted to leave you today with one top tip from each of us about dealing with healthy or unhealthy relationships. I'm going to pass it over to Judith first.
Well, my top tip for any relationship really is communication. I would think that's up there with one of the most important aspects of a relationship, to learn how to get right, and it's not easy to do that straight away. So finding time for each other to find a way to communicate is my top tip.
Yeah, I fully agree with that. And I know I've said this a lot throughout the show, but for me, it's about making a note of things that aren't quite right, whether that's in a health context, whether that's in a work context, even whether that's in a relationship context. Although I do appreciate you do need to be very careful in those situations in case a partner sees it, reads it, and so on. But please, if you can make a note, at least you have evidence, and then you can begin to trust your own evidence, especially if things are changing around you. Thank you so much for tuning in. If you would like us to discuss any mental health topics, drop us a line, studio@wellbeingmedia.org, and we'll see you again next week.